Thank you for that. I'd now like to introduce to you Dr. Peter Brooks from the University of Sunshine Coast. Really? How on earth do you do a study in the Sunshine Coast? It's too good. He's been there since 2001 and lectures in analytical and organic chemistries. Dr. Brooks has extensive research experience and works on projects involving environmental monitoring and bioactives in Australian honey. So he'll be talking to us about Manuka and the Australian story. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'd like to thank the committee first of all for inviting me to come and talk about Australian leptospermum research. And also I'd like to talk a bit about some of the collaborations we've had with the New Zealand industry. Just to point out first, if you see my left hand under control of Satan, it's because I have Parkinson's disease. It tends to shake during presentations. Anyway, we're about an hour's north of Brisbane on the Sunshine Coast, and we've been working with leptospermum honeys for about the last 7 years. So Australian industry's had a fair bit to catch up with Manuka in New Zealand. You've done a lot of research over the last 20 years, and we're really in the infancy, but we're catching up fairly quickly, I think, in the basis of the science of leptospermum research. Okay, very good. First of all, we know the value of Manuka honey came around because of its reputation as an antibacterial agent. So when Manuka honey is placed on an infected wound, or I'm going to call it leptospermum from now on because of the species difference. So when I'll talk about the leptospermum honeys, I'll refer to them by the species name. So when leptospermum honeys are applied to infected wounds, they draw the infection out, breaking up the bacterial biofilm, and the components within the honey, particularly methylglyoxal, destroy the infection. And in that way, it's much more effective than some of the pharmaceuticals for the same thing. Some of the antibiotics, as you know, are becoming resistant to drugs, are becoming resistant. And Manuka and leptospermum honeys are not getting resistant. So they have as effective as the bacterial agents, but not gaining resistance within the bacterial community. They also promote tissue regeneration. So once the wound has been cleared of the infection, you still have damaged tissue underneath. And that's damaged tissue has to regrow and seal over the wound. And the honeys present an environment which the tissue can regrow and also dampens inflammation, so the wound actually heals faster. In fact, non-infected wounds such as ulcers, pressure sores and burns that are not infected, and therefore methylglyoxal is not going to have an effect on, will actually heal faster with these honeys. I have a friend who's been in a wheelchair for 30 years and he had pressure sores on his backside, and pharmaceuticals were not helping that situation. But we gave him some active leptospermum honeys and it cleared up the condition. It was dampening the inflammation and allowing the wound to heal. These honeys are anti-inflammatory, so one of their actions about helping wounds heal is dampening down the inflammation reaction that happens in wounds. And I'll be talking about inflammation and the way honeys dampen inflammation a little bit later. They're also antioxidant in the properties. So these later two properties of being anti-inflammatory and antioxidants are also worth pursuing in the future, because Manuka honey or Scoparium honey, if you eat it, the antibacterial action is neutralised when it hits your stomach. But you're still getting anti-inflammatory and antioxidant compounds. And we can talk about the health benefits of eating Scoparium and leptospermum honeys based on the anti-inflammation and anti-actions of these honeys. As a consequence of these properties, as you know, leptospermum honeys are getting high value to the beekeepers. In New Zealand, you're getting $100 plus for an active Manuka honey. In Australia, we're getting about $50 to $60 for the same activity leptospermum honeys. But this compares to about $5 or $6 for your traditional table honeys. So there's a lot of demand for seeking out more of these, as you know, in New Zealand, but also in Australia, and finding new sources of leptospermum honeys in Australia. Unfortunately, those high returns are also attracting frauds and mislabeled honeys into the marketplace, particularly on international markets where fake honeys, for want of a better word, are being sold off as active leptospermum honeys. This threatens your income stream, also threatens the reputation of the true blue leptospermum honeys. So something has to be done to actually allow importing countries test honeys to make sure it's the real Rigididge honey. And it's very good to hear Susie talk this morning about what the MPI is doing to actually find a fingerprint for Scoparium honey here in New Zealand so it can be protected. what we basically need is a test that an importing country can actually detect very quickly, screen rapidly for multiple honeys coming into the country or being produced, and saying whether it's meeting the actual fingerprint of that honey that's required. I'm going to talk a lot about chromatography, and as an analogy to chromatography, I could say if I held my hand up sideways like that, you know there's a bunch of fingers and thumbs, but you can't tell which or how many. But if I turn my hand sideways, you can now tell how many components are present, what they are, and how much. Chromatography takes a mixture that you can't tell what's in it and basically turns it sideways. And I'm going to be talking about high-performance liquid chromatography as a means of separating the components within the honey and determining what's present. We've heard that dihydroxyacetone and methyl glycol are markers of an active Scoparium honey and all active leptospermum honeys. Another one we've heard a lot about is leptospirin as being something that is in Scoparium honey from New Zealand. It's also in Australian active leptospermum honeys quite often. So what we need are markers that are unique, and we call them biomarkers, something that's unique to a honey type and can distinguish that honey from other honeys. So these are fingerprint phenolic profiles. The one on the left is your Scoparium honey here. We have Scoparium in Australia as well, by the way. Your Scoparium probably blew east from Tasmania many years ago. But our Tasmanian Scoparium is also up there, and it's got a very similar fingerprint, and I've labelled some of the compounds that are present. So there's kojic acid labelled Ka, that's been reported in some papers as a marker of Scoparium honey. Leptospirin's LEP is up there as a marker, you can see that they're both. And I've put methyl syringate there as MSR. That's also been reported as active, as a unique marker, but it's in most honeys. One that stands out there in the Tasmanian Scoparium is 4-methoxyphenol-lactic acid. I've put up this 4-MPL. Now, it's much higher in our Tasmanian Scoparium from your Scoparium. So if I said that is your Scoparium from New Zealand, our Scoparium would have that finger 10 times higher. So it's the 4-methoxyphenolactic acid is about 4 times higher in our Scoparium than yours, but the fingerprint is very much the same. Interesting that 4-methoxyphenolactic acid is also in your Canuka Kunzea ericoides. So I know this debate over here is whether Manuka and Canuka are the same thing. Canuka Kunzea ericoides does not have dihydroxyacetone or methyl glyoxal. It also doesn't have leptospirin, that other marker for Scoparium honey. And if you have a look at the two traces there, it's distinctly different. So I'll leave it up to you as whether you think Kunzea and Scoparium are the same honey or not. But I'll leave it as they have very different fingerprints, very different components. We've got a number of leptospermum honeys in Australia. So just to run a couple more, just to show you how these fingerprints work. These are Levigardum and Whitey Eye. And you can see from both of those honey types, there's very little leptospirin marker in it. So one of the things that Susie was talking about is leptospirin a marker of Scoparium honey, or in general, it's not a marker for every single leptospermum honey. It's in Scoparium, it's in some, it's not in others. It's not in those two particular honeys that we get quite a bit of. But you see the profiles are quite different, so it is possible to tell the difference between leptospermum honeys based on these phenolic and flavonoid profiles we get by HPLC. One of our major active leptospermum honeys is Polygalifolium. Also known as jellybush over in Australia. It's got quite a bit of leptospirin in it. The fingerprint is quite similar to Manuka, but there is a couple of, your Scoparium, I won't call it Manuka. Your Scoparium and our Polygalifolium have similar fingerprints, not exactly the same, but if you go into the smaller components, there are some difference. But the reason why these fingerprinting and simple tests determine the origin of the honey is important. On the right-hand side is a honey that we bought in a health food store. A small jar was $50, something like $250 a kilo if you worked it out. And if you have a look at its fingerprint, there's none of the phenolic markers that are required for a Polygalifolium honey. There was no DHA or MGO in that honey when we tested as well. It's been some nondescript honey, slightly cooked to make it look about the same, and it's a fake. And these honeys going on the marketplace are causing our beekeepers to lose money when they have the Rigidage product. All right, another thing that's important, as I was saying with honeys, is to look at their anti-inflammatory action. Everybody focuses on the antibacterial action. But if you think about it, you've got pressure sores, ulcers, people are getting older, diabetic ulcers that need to be treated, and honey is actually a very good treatment on those. They dampen the inflammation, and they allow the tissue to regenerate. An ulcer is an inflamed sore that's not infected, but it's locked in the inflamed stage. So if we can look at honeys that are anti-inflammatory, we have another marketing tool, or we can say that a lot of diseases are inflammatory in nature. If you're eating the honeys, then you're getting the action of these anti-inflammatory compounds. So we investigated the arachidonic cascade, the arachidonic pro-inflammatory cascade. So when a wound is caused and you have an assault on the body, inflammation is the first stage of defense. But if that inflammation stage hangs around too long, the wound doesn't heal. So we looked at this arachidonic acid cascade and looked at a key enzyme in it, which is 5-lipoxygenase. As that cascade goes through this natural process, it generates pro-inflammatory molecules like leukotriene B4s and reactive oxygen species. They're what's actually causing inflammation. But if we can block that 5-lipoxygenase enzyme, then we have a way of dampening the inflammation down and allowing the wound to go into a healing process. So what we looked at is a number of those high purity honeys. So working again with New Zealand industry, we got some high purity New Zealand honeys, got some high purity Australian honeys, and looked at the way the phenolic compounds dampened this reaction. And to do that, we got rid of all the sugars, got rid of the water. We took about 100 grams of honey down to about half a gram of these concentrated compounds, these bio-natural compounds, and looked at the way they dampened the inflammation. Now, on the vertical scale over there, you've got the enzyme's activity. So starting off with 0 addition of these compounds, the enzyme is fully active. When you add the compounds, the enzyme gets inhibited, and we're looking at the inhibition of that enzyme. The important aspect there is what dosage of the phenolics flavonoids cause a 50% decrease in the enzyme's activity. So we applied as an IC50. On the left-hand side, you can see the New Zealand Scoparum had an activity of 430 micrograms per mil. That's pretty good. The Tasmanian Scoparum was 530-ish, so in the comparable field of activity. So these honeys, phenolics, are showing anti-inflammatory action. We looked at a number of honeys, and just to compare some of the other honeys we looked at, the most active is the least required amount of compound for this inhibition, and you see that your Scoparum there was the most active. It's the best in dampening down this inflammation cascade, followed by some of our other leptospermums, Whitei, Liversidgii, Livergardum, Polygallifolium, and a Tasmanian Scoparum, and then other honeys that we looked at were considerably less active. So out of all of that, the most active honeys in dampening inflammation are the Leptospermum family of honeys. Now, at work, at the university where I work, a number of the secretaries have psoriasis and eczema, and they love these Leptospermum honeys because they're skin inflammation. And if you think about it, something that dampens the inflammation on your skin is going to settle those pathologies down. So why donate excess honeys to my secretaries? And they can swear that it improves the symptoms of those inflammation-type diseases, that the pathologies they have. So we could promote our honeys now of more of not just on antibacterial, but anti-inflammatory and a number of skin treatments. I also see on the marketplace a number of products that have Scoparum or / Leptospermum honeys added to skin creams for skin irritation type things. But the most well-known attribute of these honeys is their antibacterial action. And we know that's based on a non-peroxide activity. So if you knock out the peroxide activity, the methyl glyoxal in Leptospermum honeys gives it a non-peroxide activity. So the top slide is some work that was done by University of Waikato several years ago, where on the vertical scale is the non-peroxide activity squared. So take the NPA, square it, so NPA 10 becomes 100, NPA 20 becomes 400. And plot that against the methyl glyoxal content of a large number of honeys, and you get a straight line correlation. And that's where the activity of the leptospermum type honeys has been linked to the methyl glyoxyl content. On the bottom graph is some work we did a couple of years ago with a range of Australian leptospermum honeys. And if you see that the line is almost identical to what you're getting for Scoparum over here. So the good news for me is that it doesn't matter where the leptospermum honey came from, it's the methyl glyoxyl content that's important. So for the NPA rating, the value of antibacterial, it's the non-peroxide activity, hence the methyl glyoxyl, that's important. But when we look at where this methyl glyoxyl comes from, it's not in the nectar of the flower. The methyl glyoxyl develops in the honey as the honey matures. So the dihydroxyacetone, a 3-carbon sugar, is present in the nectar. Bees obviously collect the nectar, bringing the dihydroxyacetone into the hive, make the honey, and over a process of time, it converts into methyl glyoxyl. So it's important to measure methyl glyoxyl to know the value of your honey now, because that's what you're being paid on, but also the dihydroxyacetone content, particularly of a young honey. If you have a young, high DHA honey, it's worth hanging on to, and there are calculations to sort of predict what the methyl glyoxyl is going to develop into in a year or two. But if there's low DHA in your honey initially, then it's not going to develop into an active honey in the future, and you might as well sell it now and save the storage costs. Another compound that's in honey is hydroxymethylfurfural, and it's one you don't want. It's a marker of aged or mistreated honeys. And there's a limit that's been set of 40 parts per million on hydroxymethylfurfural in honeys before it can be rejected for import into certain countries. In Australia, if the methyl HMF is above that level, there's actually a price signal to say the honey is devalued by a certain amount if the HMF is going high. So about 4 years ago, you would have paid for individual tests for DHA, HMF and MGO, maybe $100 for each test. So your honey was $300 to be tested. Our lab developed the 3-in-1 test where those 3 compounds are analysed in a single run. Now with a bit of competition in the analytical testing services, you're getting all 3 compounds now tested in a single run for around $40. And just a little bit more chromatography for you, an explanation of what's happening when you get your results. Is what we do in this test, we derivatise the honey with a compound called perfluorobenzyl hydroxylamine. I call it PFBHA. And it derivatizes those 3 chemicals in the honey, puts a tag on them, and allows them to be separated from the sugars based on the chromatography. And the top trace up there is an active honey. Coming out before 4 minutes, those lumpy bits, they're the sugars being separated from the components of interest. Now, DHA is there's 2,147 parts per million. 1 part per million is 1 milligram per kilo. So that's about, well, when you calculate out, that's just over 2 grams of DHA per kilogram of honey. The MGO there is about 440 parts per million. You've got HMF fairly low at 17, so this to me is a fairly young honey based on those ratios. The peak labelled internal stand is a yardstick. We have to have something to measure against, so that's added to the honey so we make a comparison. So if I look at that honey there, it is an active honey. There's a high DHA to MGO ratio. It's got a way to mature further. Leave it 6 months and might get to 600 MGO. The HMF is low, so it's still quite young and safe to pass on. And if you go back to those previous graphs, that 440 ppm MGO equates to approximately a 14 plus NPA. The honey below it is either not a leptospermum honey, so it never had DHA or MGO in it, or it's been mistreated by being heated to try to accelerate the aging of the honey. But you can see that it's not active, it's never going to be active, HMF is through the roof, that honey cannot be exported, it'll be rejected at the import if they measure the HMF in it. So that's now almost a valueless honey. I often get asked, what will my honey go in 6 to 12 months? So beekeepers get these results and they want to know what's going to happen with their honey. And to answer that question, we took 10 active honeys and stored them around at 22 degrees for 12 months and remeasured them. Now, the average content of the honeys to begin with was 1760 DHA and 260 MGO. I look at that number and I say that honey is probably about 3 months old at this stage. Stored them for 12 months and looked at the change in levels of those two compounds. The average loss of DHA was 44%, but that was different between the individual honeys, 33 to 55, or 52, sorry, and looked at the conversion of that lost DHA into new MGO. So how much did the MGO rise? And on average, it rose by 40%. So of the loss, 40% was converted into MGO. But again, that's over a fairly wide range of 34 to 61%. Now, I read those ranges that's happening there is every honey is a little bit different. Different in its water content, acidity, amino acid and protein content, all components that are important in the conversion of DHA to MGO. And quite often when I've seen honeys, their conversion will go for 15 or 18 months and then just stop. It doesn't change after a period of time because a critical factor has changed in your honey. It could also be because Australia's got multiple Leptospermum species that, again, the honey is a little bit different. I've seen over here in New Zealand predictors of conversion for your honeys, but that could be much tighter ranges because you've got one species instead of the wide range of species we have there. So I tell Australian beekeepers a 40-40 rule. If you've got a young active honey, in 12 months if you manage it properly, 40% of that DHA will be lost, and then 40% of that will go into new methylglyoxal. We also looked at the effect of temperature on honey, temperature storage on honey, and again I've seen a little bit different statistics over here in New Zealand, but let me just run through what's happening here. We took 3 active honeys. They started off at 2400 DHA and about 650 MGO, just one batch, separated and stored at different temperatures. One storage was at 5 degrees, and that's the green line. One storage was at 22 degrees, that's red. And one storage at 35 degrees, and that's the limey yellowy colour. And looking at the DHA, there's very little change at 5 degrees. The honey is stable. If you store your honey at 5 degrees, it'll remain stable. At 22 degrees, the DHA is dropping slowly, as you would expect if there is a conversion. It's doing what it should do. It's converting over to something. But at 35 degrees, you see the DHA has crashed. It's dropped 2,000 ppm. But where is it going? Has it gone into new MGO, or is it just gone? If we look at, oops, that's a worry. If we look over at the MGO, at 5 degrees, so I'll flick through this quickly, 5 degrees, the MGO is stable. At 22 degrees, the MGO is increasing at a 40% conversion roughly. At 35 degrees, it's not going into new MGO. In fact, the MGO has dropped. I tell beekeepers, do not warm your honey, not for prolonged periods. You're not going to convert it into MGO, you're going to destroy its value. The last slide, I'll just focus on the 35 degrees result. HMF at 35 degrees is going through the roof. You've turned your honey into Vegemite. Don't do it. Don't preheat your honey. Next part of the project is to look at the new sources and bioactivities of honey. I'll focus on the new sources. Australia's got 83 species of Leptospermum honey, and we want to know which ones are active. I've got a PhD student working on this, and coincidentally, he happens to be a New Zealander. Hiss. This is the distribution of Leptospermums around Australia. Each of those dots is a herbarium record of where Leptospermum was of different species. It's over a huge area of Australia. We've tested 35 species so far and determined the nectar activity of those. I think my student's got the best project ever. He gets to go all around Australia looking at Leptospermums with beekeepers. We've had honeys donated to us, and we've distributed the honeys as to where the most active regions. I put this up here just to show you where the most active honeys are coming from. There's a hot spot around southeast Queensland and northeastern New South Wales where there's a lot of active honeys produced, but there's other areas in Australia that also produce some activity of honey. Could be lesser activity because there's lesser concentration of Leptospermums. So keep moving on. We developed the method, for testing the nectar activity. We adapted the previous method so we can measure sugar and DHA in a single run. This is your typical result of DHA to sugars in a typical run. Up early are the sugars, and at at 4.7 minutes, is the DHA. Ratio of those two, we can tell the ratio of DHA in the nectar and how active it'd be. So let's just jump through some quick slides. I'm going to split it up to East Coast, Tasmania and Western Australia. This is East Coast. We've put there no detectable DHA in the nectar. Low is 100 to 2,000. Medium is 2,000 to 10,000. And above DHA 10,000 in the wild variety is a high DHA. So some of those like Levagadum, beautiful big tree, bees love it, lots of nectar. It's not active, but it'll never produce an active honey. There's no DHA in the honey. But it could be very good for treating things like ulcers and pressure sores, which aren't infected to begin with. So jumping through a couple more, you can see that you've got Scoparium there in New Zealand, about 2,100 activity on average. That compares about 3,000 for your wild Scoparium over here in New Zealand. But there's a couple other ones there I just want to point out. Liversidii there, almost 9,500 for the wild type plant. Polygallifolium, our most active, most common species, 8,500. But that goes from Queensland down to the New South Wales-Victoria border. There's hot spots around where we live in southeast Queensland where the average is about 11,000. Some species, some varieties are less active, but we've got examples of polygall that are 14,000 activity and hybrids with YDI that are about 18,000. But you've got a couple of other ones that are more active again. Speciosium and YDI, very active, but not much nectar flow. I'll keep moving on quickly. This is Tasmania now, and I wanted to point out the Scoparium in Tasmania. It's a little bit higher. We find individual trees there from 1,000 to 6,000 activity. Tasmanian Scoparium, my time is up, goes from there to about 10 metres high. There's a lot of varietal differences. And over in Western Australia where we're moving on to, there's a number of species over there that we've got to do more testing on, but a lot are active, inactive. The reason why we're doing this is an information kit for beekeepers. Beekeepers don't know which species to target, when to target, and sometimes what's the difference between Leptospermum and tea tree. So we're trying to get the information out there for Australian beekeepers. Here's something that's really interesting. There are non-Leptospermums in Australia that produce DHA in their nectar. These are two cousins to Leptospermum, and they have medium level activity. So potentially there are other species out there, not Leptospermums, that also produce it. There's a strong genetic effect that happens within these trees, and we can find within one site trees that are 3 times the activity of across the range of sites. So these are just 2 of the species we went back to and tested several times to move and find out a genetic factor, or whether we need to look at all seed for production, or whether we look at the higher activity specimens for plantation productions. All right, thank you very much. Move on. So, questions? No questions? Very good. Okay.
Has there been any research, or have you done any work on developing a mobile chromatography test, some kind of field kit that could enable beekeepers to themselves achieve those testing results?
No, unfortunately not. That would be the gold standard, be able to have the beekeeper test whether their frames or their hives are active. So at the moment, no. I do know there's a fluorescent test kit that is being developed here in New Zealand to look at the manuka-ness, for want of a better word, of the honey. But that would be great if we could, but no. Okay. All right. Thank you.